Crystal chandeliers cast a harsh, unforgiving light on polished silver. It was their 5th anniversary. 24 of society's most vicious gossips sat waiting for their host to appear. When heavy mahogany doors finally swung open, Lord Frederick did not step through alone. He had a woman on his arm, his mistress. Silence hit the room like a physical blow. From the head of the table his wife did not flinch. But from the shadows near the hearth, Duke Dominic saw everything. Cecily Harrington sat at the head of a mahogany table that spanned 18 feet. 5 years ago, when she first came to this house as a bride, she had thought the table was grand. Tonight, it felt like a battlefield, and she was entirely unarmored. The dining room was stifling. It was the height of the London season, and the air was thick with the competing scents of roasted lamb, heavy perfumes, and the beeswax candles melting in the chandeliers overhead. 24 guests were seated, their crystal glasses full, their mouths moving in polite, meaningless chatter. The chair opposite Cecily, at the far end of the long expanse of wood and silver, was empty. Frederick was late, again. Cecily kept her posture rigid. She did not lean against the back of her velvet chair. She breathed shallowly against the constraints of her silk corsetry, letting the dull ache in her ribs ground her. She smiled at Lord Holloway to her left, nodding as the older man droned on about agricultural yields in Somerset. She didn't hear a word. Her hearing was tuned entirely to the heavy oak doors at the end of the room. Her marriage was a transaction. She had learned this by the end of her first month as Frederick's wife. He wanted her dowry to settle his gambling debts. Her father wanted a titled son-in-law. There was no love, but for a time there had been a fragile, polite truce. Then came the whispers. Then came the blatant absences. Now there was simply a cold, hollow space where a marriage should have been. But tonight was their anniversary. 5 years, a milestone that demanded a performance, and Cecily was nothing if not a professional at playing the unbothered wife. The brass clock on the mantel ticked. 8:30. The soup was getting cold. Finally, the footman grasped the brass handles of the double doors and pulled them open. The low hum of conversation in the room died. It did not taper off. It severed abruptly as if a string had been cut. Frederick stood in the doorway. He was a handsome man, with a boyish charm that had survived years of heavy drinking and late nights. His cravat was slightly askew, but it was not his messy attire that drew the collective, breathless stare of the 24 guests. It was the woman clinging to his arm. She was young. She had dark hair piled loosely on her head. A shade of crimson silk draped over her shoulders that was entirely too bright for a respectable dinner party, and a mouth curved in a nervous, triumphant little smile. Lydia, the widow of a minor baron, the worst-kept secret in London. Cecily's heart performed a single, violent thrash against her ribcage. Then it went terrifyingly numb. She did not gasp. She did not drop her wine glass. She simply stared down the length of the table at her husband. "Apologies for the delay," Frederick announced, his voice booming with a false, jovial cheer that echoed off the high ceiling. "A carriage wheel splintered on Mayfair. I found Lady Stanton stranded on the roadside, quite distressed. I could hardly leave her to the elements, could I? I insisted she join us. It was a lie, a flimsy, pathetic lie. The sky outside was perfectly clear, and Lydia Stanton lived in the opposite direction of Frederick's club." The guests froze. Forks hovered inches from mouths. Eyes darted from Frederick to Lydia, and then, with uniform dread and hunger, to Cecily. Cecily felt the heat of 24 stares burning into her skin. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. She could feel the blood rushing in her ears. Frederick was daring her. He was standing there, in their home, on the night meant to celebrate their union, rubbing his infidelity in her face and waiting for her to break. He wanted a scene. He wanted her to scream, so he could call her hysterical. Cecily slowly set her crystal goblet down. The tiny clink of glass against the wood sounded like a gunshot. "How fortunate that you were passing by, Frederick," Cecily said. Her voice was perfectly level. It carried no tremor, no anger. It was smooth as glass, and just as sharp. "And how entirely like you to play the savior." She turned to the footman standing frozen by the wall. "Bates, please fetch another chair for Lady Stanton. Place it beside Lord Frederick. I am sure they have much to discuss after such a harrowing ordeal." Frederick's smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second. He had expected tears. He had expected rage. He did not expect to be seamlessly managed like an unruly child. "Of course, my lady," the footman murmured, practically running to fetch a chair. As Frederick and Lydia made their way to the end of the table, the guests collectively exhaled. The conversation resumed, but it was a frantic, hushed buzzing. They were no longer talking about agriculture or the weather. They were talking about her. Cecily picked up her silver spoon. She dipped it into her soup. Her hand under the table was trembling so violently she had to press it hard against her thigh to make it stop. From the middle of the table, a pair of dark eyes locked onto her. Dominic, the Duke of Waverley, had not spoken a word since Frederick entered. He leaned back in his chair, a half-empty glass of claret in his hand, watching the scene unfold with the detached fascination of a man observing a carriage wreck. He saw the white-knuckled grip Cecily had on her silk gown beneath the table. He saw the microscopic tightening of her jaw. And as she gracefully lifted her spoon to her mouth, pretending to eat, Dominic realized he had never seen a woman bleed out so elegantly in his life. The dinner service proceeded, a slow, agonizing parade of silver platters and clinking porcelain. Cecily ate nothing. She cut her roast bird into meticulously small pieces, moving them around the rim of her plate. She engaged Lord Holloway in a discussion about parliamentary reform. She poured wine. She played the perfect hostess. All while a cold, heavy stone sat at the bottom of her stomach. At the far end of the table, Frederick had dropped any pretense of propriety. He leaned close to Lydia. He poured her wine from his own carafe. When the footman presented a platter of sweetmeats, Frederick reached out, selected a sugared plum, and placed it directly onto Lydia's plate. Lydia giggled. The sound was high and breathy, slicing through the heavy atmosphere of the dining room. Several guests looked down at their laps, deeply uncomfortable. Others watched with thinly veiled, morbid curiosity. Dominic watched Cecily. He was not a man given to sentimentality. At 34, Waverley was known in the ton as a cynic, a man who viewed London society as a circus of hypocrites and fools. He had attended this dinner only because his sister had begged him to make an appearance. He had expected a dull evening of bad food and worse conversation. Instead, he found himself entirely captivated by the quiet, brutal warfare occurring at the ends of the table. He despised Frederick Harrington. He always had. Frederick was a man of weak character and loud appetites. But this, bringing a mistress to an anniversary dinner, was not just weak. It was cruel. It was a deliberate, public execution of his wife's dignity. Dominic took a slow sip of his claret, his gaze drifting back to Cecily. She was pale. Her skin looked almost translucent in the candlelight. Yet there was a rigid, unbreakable architecture to her spine. She wasn't just surviving the dinner, she was enduring it with a terrifying grace. A lovely vintage, wouldn't you say, Your Grace? Dominic pulled his attention away from Cecily and glanced at the woman seated beside him. Lady Agatha, a notorious gossip, was looking at him with bright, predatory eyes. "It is passable," Dominic replied, his voice a low, gravelly drawl. "Passable," Lady Agatha tittered. "Much like the excuses presented at the door. I must say I have never seen anything quite so bold. Poor Lady Harrington. Though one must admit she lacks a certain warmth. Perhaps that is why he strays." Dominic set his glass down. He did not slam it, but the deliberate weight of the movement made Lady Agatha jump. He turned his head slowly, fixing his dark, heavy stare on the older woman. "I find," Dominic said, his tone dangerously quiet, "that a woman's warmth is rarely the issue, Lady Agatha. It is more often a man's inability to appreciate anything that doesn't cater to his immediate, base impulses. A dog will leave a warm hearth for a piece of rotten meat in the alley simply because it is unguarded." Lady Agatha's mouth snapped shut. She flushed a deep, mottled red and quickly turned her attention back to her plate. Dominic looked back towards the head of the table. Cecily was staring right at him. She had heard him. For a single, suspended second, the noise of the dining room faded. Cecily looked at the Duke of Waverley. She knew his reputation. A rake, some said. A misanthrope. Others claimed. He was intimidating, with sharp cheekbones, a shadow of stubble he never seemed to bother shaving close enough, and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He did not offer her a pitying smile. He did not look away out of politeness. He simply held her gaze, raised his glass an inch off the table in a silent, solitary toast to her endurance, and drank. A sudden, unexpected heat flared in Cecily's chest. It wasn't embarrassment, it was anger. Raw, pure anger that she had been burying for 5 years. Someone finally saw the grotesque reality of her life, stripped of its polite veneer. "Frederick," Cecily called out. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a scythe. The giggling at the end of the table stopped. Frederick looked up, a piece of bread halfway to his mouth. "Yes, my dear?" Frederick asked, a challenging glint in his eye. "I see you are enjoying the Bordeaux," Cecily said, gesturing slightly to the empty bottle near his elbow. "It is the 1805. My father sent it from his cellars specifically for tonight. He will be so pleased to hear you shared it with unexpected company. He always did appreciate your charitable nature." The insult was wrapped so tightly in politeness that it took a second for the room to register it. When they did, a few guests actually choked on their wine. Frederick's face darkened, the alcohol flush on his cheeks turning ugly. "Your father is a generous man, Cecily. As am I." "Indeed," Cecily said, her eyes dead and cold. "Generous to a fault. Bates, clear the plates. We will take our tea in the drawing room." She stood up. She did not wait for the men to stand first. She turned her back on her husband, her mistress, and her guests, and walked out of the room. Her spine was a steel rod, but as she passed Dominic's chair, he heard it, the faintest, hitched intake of breath. She was drowning, and she was refusing to ask for a rope. The drawing room was awash in the warm glow of the fireplace, but to Cecily it felt freezing. Normally, the men would remain in the dining room for port and cigars, while the women gossiped over tea. But tonight, the rules of society had shattered the moment Lydia Stanton walked through the door. Half the men followed the women into the drawing room, unwilling to be trapped at a table with Frederick and his blatant indiscretion. Cecily stood by the marble fireplace, her back to the flames. She held a cup of tea. She hadn't taken a sip. The porcelain was burning her palms, but she welcomed the pain. It gave her something to focus on besides the hushed, urgent whispers echoing off the silk-lined walls. "Did you see her face? He brought her right into the house. They say she hasn't shared his bed in 3 years. She kept her chin up. She watched the door. When Frederick finally strolled in, 10 minutes later, Lydia was still glued to his side. They retreated to a corner sofa, laughing softly together. Cecily felt a sudden, violent urge to throw her teacup at the wall. She wanted to scream. She wanted to tear the tapestries down, to shatter the windows, to make the outside world match the violent ruin of her life inside this house. But she didn't. She just tightened her grip on the saucer until her knuckles turned white. "If you hold that any tighter, it will break." The voice came from her right, deep, quiet, and rough like sandpaper. Cecily didn't startle, but she turned her head. Dominic, the Duke of Waverley, stepped out of the periphery and stood beside her. He didn't look at her immediately. He looked out at the room, holding a glass of amber liquid. "It is Limoges porcelain, Your Grace," Cecily said, her voice a dry whisper. "It is harder to break than it looks." "Everything breaks, Lady Harrington," Dominic replied, finally turning his head to look down at her. "It is just a matter of applying the right amount of pressure." Up close, the Duke was even more intimidating. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and there was a weariness in his dark eyes that made him look older than his years. He smelled of rain, smoke, and something distinctly sharp and masculine. "Are you offering a critique on my china, Your Grace, or my marriage?" Cecily asked. She had no energy left for polite deflections. If he wanted to mock her, she would let him do it to her face. Dominic's lips twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was an acknowledgement of her sharpness. "I don't care about your china," he said bluntly, "and your marriage is a public spectacle. It requires no critique from me." Cecily flinched. The words were a slap, harsh and unforgiving. She looked away, staring into the fire. "Then why approach me? Have you come to offer your pity? If so, you can leave it on the mantel with the rest of the dust." "I don't do pity," Dominic said. He took a sip of his drink. "I find it insulting. I came over here because I was tired of watching you pretend you aren't bleeding." Cecily closed her eyes for a brief second. The heat of the fire was pressing into her back, but his words were peeling away her armor, piece by piece. "What would you have me do?" she asked, her voice dropping to a harsh, cracked whisper. "Throw myself at his feet? Weep? Claw her eyes out? That is what they want. They want a tragic, hysterical wife to gossip about until the season ends. I will not give them the satisfaction." "No," Dominic agreed quietly. "You won't. You will just stand here, perfectly composed, while he destroys you from the inside out." Cecily looked up at him. Her eyes were bright, swimming with unshed tears that she flatly refused to let fall. "It is my burden to bear." "It is a fool's burden," Dominic countered, his voice dropping lower, meant only for her. He stepped a fraction closer. The sheer physical presence of the man blocked out the view of the room, shielding her momentarily from the staring eyes of her guests. "Loyalty is a two-way street, Cecily. When one party burns the bridge, you don't stand on the edge and pretend you can still cross. You turn around." Hearing him use her Christian name sent a strange shockwave through her chest. It wasn't overly familiar. It felt entirely deliberate. A grounding technique. "Turn around to what?" she asked bitterly. "A divorce is impossible. A separation would ruin my reputation, not his. I am trapped in this house, with a man who parades his whores in my dining room. There is nowhere to turn." Dominic looked at her. For the first time all evening, the detached cynicism left his eyes. What replaced it was something darker, something intense, heavy, and dangerous. "There is always somewhere to turn," he murmured. "You just have to stop looking at the walls of your cage and start looking for the key." Before Cecily could untangle the meaning of his words, a loud, slurred voice broke the fragile bubble of their isolation. "Waverley!" Frederick strode across the room, leaving Lydia momentarily alone on the sofa. He clapped a heavy hand on Dominic's shoulder. Dominic didn't move, but Cecily saw the subtle, dangerous tightening of the Duke's jaw. "I see you've cornered my wife." Frederick laughed, his breath reeking of brandy. "Careful, Duke, she's a cold one, likely to freeze you to death if you stand too close." Cecily felt the breath leave her lungs. The humiliation, which had been a slow drip all evening, suddenly flooded her. She looked at the floor, waiting for Dominic to laugh politely, to excuse himself, to leave her to her misery. Instead, Dominic slowly turned his head to look at Frederick's hand on his shoulder. Then, he looked at Frederick's face. "I find," Dominic said, his voice deadly quiet and vibrating with menace, "that I prefer the cold, Harrington. It preserves things of value, whereas heat just accelerates the rot. Frederick's smile vanished. The insult was direct. There was no polite rapping this time. The two men stared at each other, the tension in the room spiking so high that the surrounding conversations began to die out again. Dominic stepped back, dislodging Frederick's hand. He gave Cecily a brief, stiff bow. "Good evening, Lady Harrington," he said. He didn't look at Frederick again. He simply turned and walked out of the drawing room, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in his wake. Cecily stood by the fire, her heart hammering against her ribs. The teacup in her hands was finally cool. But for the first time in 5 years, something inside her was beginning to burn. The morning sun offered no absolution. It poured through the tall windows of Cecily's private sitting room, illuminating the dust motes dancing over the Persian rug. The house was dead quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a war. Cecily sat at her mahogany writing desk. She had not slept. Her eyes burned, dry and heavy, but her hands were perfectly steady as she smoothed the heavy parchment flat against the wood. It was a copy of her marriage settlement. She had requested it from her father's solicitor 3 years ago, during the first wave of Frederick's infidelities, and had kept it locked in the bottom drawer ever since. She read the densely packed ink. The legal language was a labyrinth designed to trap women just like her. Coverture. Upon saying her vows, Cecily had ceased to exist as a legal entity. Her massive dowry, the sprawling country estate in Kent, the coal mines in the north, all of it belonged to Frederick. He managed it. He spent it. She was entitled to a dress allowance and a roof over her head. There was no legal exit. If she left, she would leave with nothing but the clothes on her back, and society would brand her a runaway wife. Frederick would retain her fortune, and likely move Lydia into her bed before the sheets went cold. Cecily closed her eyes. The humiliation of the previous night still clung to her skin like a layer of grime. She remembered the stifled laughter, the pitying stares, the suffocating weight of Frederick's smug, alcohol-soaked breath when he challenged the Duke of Waverley. The door handle turned. There was no knock. Frederick stepped into the room. He wore a dressing gown of deep burgundy silk, his cravat undone, his hair dishevelled. The pale light was unkind to him. It highlighted the purplish bags under his eyes and the slight premature jowls forming at his jawline. He looked entirely like a man who had drunk his weight in brandy and slept poorly. He didn't look at her immediately. He walked to the silver tray on the sideboard, poured himself a glass of lukewarm water, and downed it in one swallow. "My head is splitting," he muttered, bracing his hands against the polished wood. Cecily did not look up from her paperwork. "Perhaps you should have paced yourself with my father's Bordeaux." Frederick stiffened. He turned slowly, his bloodshot eyes narrowing. "Are we going to do this today, Cecily? Play the freezing martyr? I am not in the mood." "Then you should return to your own chambers," she replied evenly. "Or better yet, return to Lady Stanton's. I am sure she has a soothing remedy for a hangover. She seems highly experienced in dealing with men's ails." Frederick crossed the room in 3 long strides. He slammed his hand flat on the desk, right over the marriage settlement, jarring the inkwell. "Do not speak of her like that. Lydia is a woman of delicate sensibilities. She was terrified last night, stranded in the dark, and you treated her like a leper." Cecily finally looked up. She stared at his hand, pressing down on the document that chained her to him, and then she looked into his face. He actually believed his own lie. He had convinced himself that bringing his mistress into their dining room was an act of chivalry, and that Cecily was the villain for not serving her tea with a smile. "Remove your hand from my desk, Frederick." The utter lack of emotion in her voice threw him. He had expected anger. He had expected tears. He had prepared to shout her down, to call her hysterical, to exert his authority. But she was looking at him with the detached curiosity one might reserve for a dead insect on the windowsill. "You embarrassed me last night." Frederick growled, leaning closer, though he did lift his hand. "Calling me out in front of Waverley. You think you're so clever with your sharp little tongue, but you are my wife. This is my house. If I choose to host Lady Stanton, you will receive her with the respect she deserves." "Respect is earned," Cecily said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. "And you have spent 5 years bankrupting yours? You will never bring that woman into this house again." Frederick barked a harsh, ugly laugh. "Or what? What will you do, Cecily? Cry to your father? Run away to the country? Go ahead. Leave. I'll keep the money, and you can rot in Kent." Cecily picked up a brass letter opener. She turned it over in her hands, feeling the cold, sharp point. "I am not leaving," she said softly. "You would like that too much. You want me gone so you can install her in my place, spend my dowry on her jewels, and play the tragic, abandoned husband to your club friends. I will not give you the satisfaction." She set the letter opener down. The clack of brass on wood was decisive. "I am staying right here," Cecily continued, holding his gaze without blinking. "But hear me clearly. Last night was the final humiliation I will absorb for you. If you parade your indiscretions in my face again, I will not weep, and I will not leave. I will simply stop protecting you." Frederick frowned, a flicker of genuine unease crossing his face. "Protecting me? From what?" "From yourself," Cecily said. "From your creditors, from the social ruin you are so desperate to invite. I have covered your gambling debts to keep the Harrington name pristine. I have hosted the men you owe money to. I have smiled at the wives of the bankers who hold the notes on your London properties. I have been the respectable, unbothered facade that keeps your fragile life from crumbling." She leaned forward slightly. "Bring her here again, Frederick, and the facade falls. I will let them tear you apart." Frederick stared at her. For a second he saw it, the sheer, immovable steel beneath her silk dressing gown. He opened his mouth to reply, to assert his dominance, but he found he had nothing to say. He sneered, a weak, defensive gesture, and turned on his heel, storming out of the room. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind him, rattling the frames on the walls. Cecily exhaled, a long, shuddering breath. Her hands were shaking again, but this time it was not from fear. She looked down at the marriage settlement. The Duke of Waverley's gravelly voice echoed in her memory. "You just have to stop looking at the walls of your cage and start looking for the key." She dragged a fresh sheet of paper toward her, dipped her pen in the ink, and began to write to her father's solicitor. She didn't need a way out. She needed leverage. The wind whipping through Hyde Park was bitter, cutting through the thin wool of Cecily's riding habit. It was late afternoon, the hour when the fashionable elite took to Rotten Row to see and be seen. Today, Cecily was the spectacle. She rode her dappled grey mare with a rigid back. As she passed the carriages lined up along the gravel path, she saw the fans rising to obscure, whispering mouths. She saw the gentlemen tipping their hats with agonizing slowness, their eyes filled with a toxic mixture of pity and amusement. The news of the anniversary dinner had spread through Mayfair like a cholera outbreak. Poor Lady Harrington. Did you hear? Right at the dinner table. A complete lack of control over her husband. She kept her chin elevated, fixing her gaze on the elm trees in the distance. She would not hide. Hiding was a confession of shame, and she had nothing to be ashamed of. The rhythmic thud of heavy hooves approached from her left. A massive, coal-black stallion pulled up smoothly beside her mare. Cecily didn't need to turn her head to know who it was. The sheer physical gravity of the man settled over the space between them. "You are drawing a crowd, Lady Harrington," the Duke of Waverley said. Dominic rode with a relaxed, loose-limbed grace that belied the immense power of the animal beneath him. He wore a dark riding coat, his cravat tied with negligent perfection, and his sharp jaw shadowed by the afternoon light. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply fell into step beside her. "I imagine I am," Cecily replied, keeping her eyes forward. "It seems my marriage is the most entertaining theatrical production in London this season. Tragedy usually is, Dominic noted, his voice carrying easily over the sound of the wind and the crunching gravel. Though I admit I prefer a revenge play. Cecily tightened her grip on the reins. Are you here to mock me again, Your Grace? Because I have already met my quota of humiliation for the day. I have never mocked you, Dominic said, the gravel in his voice smoothed out into something flat and serious. I insulted your husband. There is a vast difference, and if you cannot tell them apart, you are in worse trouble than I thought. Cecily finally turned her head. He was looking right at her, his dark eyes stripping away her carefully constructed mask. What do you want, Waverley? She asked, dropping the formal titles. The exhaustion of the last 24 hours was catching up to her. Dominic didn't answer immediately. He adjusted his grip on his reins, guiding his stallion to walk closer to her mare, boxing out a passing carriage so that they were insulated in a brief pocket of privacy. I was at White's this morning, Dominic said quietly. Your husband was holding court. He was quite vocal about his triumph last night. Cecily's stomach plummeted. She felt cold sweat prick at her hairline. I do not care what Frederick says to his drinking companions. You should, Dominic countered, because he was not just boasting about his mistress. He was boasting about his finances. He claimed he is finalizing a massive investment in a West Indies shipping venture. A venture run by Lord Linwood. Cecily frowned, pulling back slightly on the reins. Lord Linwood? That man is a known swindler. The Crown nearly indicted him last year for fraud. Frederick doesn't have the capital for a massive investment. His accounts are barely holding the estates together. I know, Dominic said, which means he is borrowing heavily, and he is doing it against something of immense value to secure the loan, the marriage settlement. Cecily breathed, the pieces snapping together with sickening clarity. He has full control of my dowry and the Kent estate, but he can't sell Kent without my father's signature. It's entailed. He doesn't need to sell it, Dominic explained, his eyes locked on her pale face. He only needs to leverage it. If Linwood's venture goes under, and it will, the man builds ships out of rotting timber. Harrington will default. The creditors will seize the estate. Your father's estate. Your safety net. Cecily stopped her horse. The mare tossed her head, anxious at the sudden halt. Dominic stopped his stallion a few paces ahead, turning the massive beast around to face her. The wind howled around them, but Cecily felt entirely numb. Frederick wasn't just breaking her heart. He was actively dismantling her future, her family's legacy, to fund a pipe dream and keep his mistress in rubies. Why are you telling me this? Cecily asked, her voice shaking slightly. You owe me nothing. You hate society. You hate the gossip. Why involve yourself in my ruin? Dominic looked at her. He took in the tight lines of tension around her mouth, the defiant, defensive tilt of her chin, and the quiet desperation burning in her eyes. Because I despise watching a competent player lose a game simply because they don't know the rules have changed, Dominic said, his voice dropping low, a deep rumble that vibrated in the cold air. Your husband is an idiot, Cecily. But an idiot with a hammer can still tear down a house if no one takes the hammer away. He guided his horse closer, leaning slightly over the pommel of his saddle. You told me last night you were trapped, he murmured. You are only trapped by the law. The law says he owns your money. The law says he commands your obedience. So you must operate outside of it. How? She asked, the words slipping out before she could stop it. It was a plea. Leverage, Dominic said simply. Linwood is desperate for the capital. Harrington is desperate for the prestige. They are a house of cards. All you have to do is find the right wind and blow. He straightened up in the saddle, pulling his gloves tight. The Duchess of Pembroke is hosting her annual masquerade tomorrow evening. Linwood will be there, Harrington will be there, and I imagine, given his current streak of brazen stupidity, he will bring Lady Stanton. Dominic tipped his hat to her, a gesture stripped of society's hollow politeness and replaced with a sharp, challenging respect. "Survive, Lady Harrington," he said softly, "or win. It is entirely up to you." He turned his stallion and spurred the horse into a canter, leaving Cecily alone in the wind. She watched his broad shoulders retreat, the fear in her chest slowly transmuting into something else, something hard, cold, and razor-sharp. She nudged her mare forward. She had a dress to select for tomorrow night. The Pembroke masquerade was the glittering apex of the London season. The ballroom was a sea of crushed velvet, sparkling diamonds, and feathered masks. A string orchestra played a sweeping waltz from the gallery, barely drowning out the cacophony of 100 overlapping conversations. Cecily arrived late. She did not wear a mask to obscure her face. She wore a simple, unadorned domino mask of black silk that highlighted the sharp angles of her cheekbones and the icy blue of her eyes. Her gown was a deep, midnight blue, stripped of the heavy embroidery and lace fashionable at the time. It was elegant, severe, and entirely unapologetic. When she stood at the top of the grand staircase, the footman banged his staff on the marble floor. "Lady Harrington." The name dropped into the ballroom like a stone into a still pond. The waltz continued, but the talking died. Hundreds of faces turned upward, masks failing to hide the blatant, hungry curiosity. They knew Frederick was already here. They knew Lydia Stanton was with him. The entire room braced for a public collapse. Cecily gripped her fan, her knuckles white beneath her kid-skin gloves. She forced her breathing to slow. When she descended the stairs, she moved with a slow, deliberate grace, acknowledging no one, her eyes sweeping the room until she found her target. It wasn't Frederick. Near the massive marble fireplace, a cluster of older, formidable women held court. The patronesses, the gatekeepers of the Tond, Lady Jersey, the Duchess of Pembroke herself. These women dictated who existed in London society and who was exiled to the country in disgrace. Cecily walked directly toward them. The crowd parted for her, murmuring as she passed. "Duchess," Cecily said, dipping into a flawless, deep curtsy before the formidable host. The Duchess of Pembroke, an older woman with sharp eyes and zero tolerance for scandal, looked down her nose. "Lady Harrington, we so did not expect you." "I cannot imagine why," Cecily replied, rising smoothly. Her voice was pleasant, entirely devoid of strain. "It is the highlight of the season. I would not miss it." Lady Jersey snapped her fan shut. "Given the current climate of your household, my dear, one might assume you would prefer a quiet evening at home." Cecily smiled. It was a terrifying smile. It did not reach her eyes. "My household is perfectly managed, Lady Jersey. It is my husband's business ventures that require attention." Cecily took a casual step closer to the patronesses, lowering her voice just enough to force them to lean in. "I am deeply concerned. I hear he is associating heavily with Lord Linwood." The Duchess of Pembroke stiffened. "Linwood. The man is a charlatan. He nearly cost my nephew £10,000 in that fraudulent canal scheme." "Indeed," Cecily murmured, projecting an aura of polite distress. "Frederick is quite taken with him. He speaks of heavily backing Linwood's new shipping venture, using the Harrington estates as collateral." She paused, letting the silence hang for a fraction of a second. "I only hope Linwood's creditors do not look to Frederick's social circle when the ships inevitably sink. Ruin has such a terrible habit of spreading to anyone adjacent to it." It was a masterful surgical strike. In 30 seconds, Cecily had planted a bomb. She hadn't complained about her marriage. She hadn't mentioned the mistress. She had threatened their money and their reputations. She tied Frederick's social standing to a known swindler and made him a liability. The patronesses exchanged rapid, alarmed glances. Frederick was no longer an amusing scandal. He was an economic contagion. "Thank you for the warning, Cecily," the Duchess said, her voice completely devoid of its previous condescension. She looked across the room to where Frederick was laughing with a group of men, Lydia Stanton on his arm. The Duchess's eyes narrowed into slits of pure ice. It seems Lord Harrington requires a sharp lesson in appropriate associations. Cecily nodded graciously. She turned to walk away, the adrenaline roaring in her ears. She had done it. She had severed his social lifeline. As she navigated the edge of the dance floor, a figure stepped into her path, blocking her way. "Cecily!" It was Frederick. He smelled of wine and expensive cologne. His mask was pushed up on his forehead, his face flushed. And clinging tightly to his arm, wearing a gown of garish yellow silk, and a smirk that made Cecily's stomach turn, was Lydia. The surrounding crowd instantly went quiet, edging closer. The confrontation they had been waiting for all season was finally happening. "Frederick?" Cecily said flatly. She did not look at Lydia. She did not acknowledge the woman's existence. "You are making a spectacle of yourself, arriving alone!" he hissed, grabbing her elbow. "Go home." Cecily looked down at his hand on her arm. She didn't pull away. She just stared at it until the sheer intensity of her disgust made him loosen his grip. "I am enjoying the party," she said clearly, ensuring her voice carried to the avid listeners. "Though the air in this particular corner of the room has suddenly become quite foul." Lydia's smirk vanished. She stepped forward, puffing up her chest. "There is no need for jealousy, Lady Harrington. Frederick simply prefers a woman with blood in her veins rather than ice." A collective, sharp intake of breath echoed through the bystanders. A mistress addressing a wife in public was an unimaginable breach of the rules. Cecily finally shifted her gaze to Lydia. She looked at the woman from the hem of her yellow gown to the cheap feathers in her hair. She looked at her not with anger, but with profound, devastating boredom. Cecily performed the cut direct. She simply turned her head away, completely erasing Lydia from her field of vision, and looked back at Frederick. "If you bring your livestock into the ballroom, Frederick, you really should ensure it is house-trained," Cecily said smoothly. Frederick's face turned a mottled, furious purple. He stepped forward, his hand raising instinctively, driven by alcohol and absolute rage. Cecily didn't flinch. She braced herself for the impact, knowing that if he struck her here, he was utterly and completely destroyed. The blow never landed. A large, gloved hand shot out of the crowd and clamped around Frederick's wrist like an iron vice. The momentum of Frederick's swing was halted so abruptly that his shoulder popped audibly. "I believe," a rough, deep voice echoed through the silence, "that the lady is spoken for this dance." Dominic stepped out of the shadows of the pillars. He wore a severe black evening coat, no mask, and a look of cold, murderous intent that made the surrounding crowd physically recoil. He didn't look at Frederick, he looked at Cecily. He held Frederick's wrist for a second longer than necessary, squeezing until Frederick let out a strangled gasp of pain, and then he tossed the arm away as if discarding something foul. Dominic stepped between Cecily and her husband, completely blocking Frederick from her view. He bowed, a slow, deep show of absolute respect. "Lady Harrington," Dominic murmured, offering his hand. "Will you do me the honor?" Cecily looked at his large, steady hand. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but as she placed her gloved hand in his, a profound sense of calm washed over her. "I would be delighted, Your Grace." Dominic led her onto the floor just as the orchestra struck up a new, sweeping waltz. He pulled her into his arms. One hand settled firmly on her waist, the heat of his palm seeping through the silk of her dress. As they began to turn, sweeping across the floor in perfect time with the music, Cecily looked over Dominic's shoulder. She saw Frederick standing near the edge of the floor, humiliated, holding his wrist, as the surrounding society deliberately turned their backs on him. "You learn quickly," Dominic said, his voice a low rumble near her ear. Cecily looked up into his dark, assessing eyes. The cynical Duke was watching her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of genuine heat in his gaze. "I had an excellent instructor," she replied softly. Dominic's hand tightened slightly on her waist, pulling her a fraction of an inch closer. "The game has only just begun, Cecily," he warned. "I know," she breathed, matching his steps flawlessly. "And it is my turn to deal." 2 weeks later, the London townhouse smelled of stale cigar smoke and panic. The collapse of Lord Linwood did not happen slowly. It happened with the sudden, violent force of a guillotine. A clerk at the Naval Registry had noticed discrepancies in Linwood's shipbuilding manifests. By Wednesday, the magistrates were asking questions. By Thursday, Linwood was on a ship bound for the continent, leaving behind a mountain of forged promissory notes and a trail of ruined investors. Frederick was the largest of them. Cecily sat in the morning room, embroidering a handkerchief. She was perfectly calm. Through the heavy oak doors of Frederick's study across the hall, she could hear the muffled sounds of destruction. A glass shattering against the fireplace, the heavy thud of a desk drawer being slammed, the frantic, high-pitched voice of his man of business trying to explain that the creditors were already drafting the seizure warrants. The masquerade had done exactly what she intended. The patronesses had cut Frederick, and society followed its leaders like sheep. When the rumors of Linwood's insolvency broke, none of Frederick's usual friends offered a loan to tide him over. No one invited him to their clubs. He was infected. The door to the morning room flew open. Frederick stood in the threshold. He looked 10 years older than he had at the anniversary dinner. His skin was grey, his eyes wide and bloodshot. The arrogant posture was gone, replaced by a frantic, nervous twitch in his shoulders. "Your father," Frederick gasped, bracing himself against the doorframe. "You must write to him, immediately. Tell him to wire £10,000. Cecily did not look up from her embroidery. She carefully pushed the silver needle through the linen. "My father is summering in the Lake District, Frederick. He is notoriously difficult to reach, and even if he were not, £10,000 is a staggering sum. What on earth for?" "Do not play the fool with me!" Frederick shouted. He crossed the room, snatching the embroidery hoop from her hands and throwing it onto the floor. "Linwood fled. The venture is dead. The creditors hold the notes on this house, the carriages, everything. If we do not pay them by Monday, they will take it all. They will take Kent." Cecily calmly folded her hands in her lap. "They cannot take Kent. Kent is entailed. It passes back to my father's line if we have no heirs. You cannot use it to settle a debt." Frederick laughed, a wet, hysterical sound. "I already did. I signed the deeds over as collateral 3 days ago. Linwood said it was just a formality, a temporary hold. I am legally your husband, Cecily. I have the right to leverage the property. You have the right to manage it." Cecily corrected quietly. "But you cannot transfer the title without my father's counter-signature, a signature you do not have." Frederick stared at her, the colour draining entirely from his face. Linwood said his lawyers found a precedent, a loophole." "Linwood lied to you, Frederick, because he needed your cash before he ran." Cecily finally stood up. She smoothed the front of her skirt. "You forged my father's signature, didn't you? To secure the collateral." Frederick took a step back, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. He looked like a drowning man who had just realized the lifeboat was an illusion. I had to," he stammered. "It was a guaranteed return. I would have paid it back before anyone noticed. It was just a signature." "It is fraud," Cecily said, her voice dropping to a terrifying, flat register. "It is a criminal offence punishable by transportation to the penal colonies." Frederick collapsed into a nearby armchair, burying his face in his hands. He began to weep. It was a pathetic, gasping sound. There was no dignity in his ruin. He was a hollow man, finally crushed by his own hollow life. Cecily looked down at him. 5 years of insults, 5 years of quiet suffering, of holding her breath while he paraded his mistresses and gambled her inheritance. She thought she would feel a rush of triumphant joy. Instead, she just felt tired. "What do I do?" Frederick sobbed into his hands. "Cecily, please, they will ruin me." They already have. A deep voice rumbled from the doorway. Frederick's head snapped up. Dominic, the Duke of Waverley, stood in the hall. He wore a heavy riding coat, his boots tracking dust onto the Persian rug. He held a thick stack of vellum papers bound in red ribbon. "Bates, let me in," Dominic said to Cecily, offering a short nod. He turned his dark, unforgiving gaze on Frederick. "I suggest you stop crying, Harrington. It offends the quiet." Frederick scrambled to his feet, swiping at his wet cheeks. "Waverley, what are you doing here? Get out of my house." "It is not your house anymore," Dominic stated. He tossed the stack of papers onto the small tea table. They landed with a heavy, definitive smack. "I bought your debt this morning. All of it. The mortgages on the Mayfair property, the gambling markers from White's, the promissory notes to Linwood's creditors. I hold the paper on your entire pathetic existence." Frederick stared at the documents, paralyzed. "Why? Why would you do that?" Dominic looked at Cecily. The coldness in his eyes evaporated for a fraction of a second, replaced by a fierce, protective heat. "Because I do not like the way you treat your wife," Dominic said. Frederick looked back and forth between the two of them. His brain, slow and addled by panic, finally began to connect the dots. The conversation at the dinner, the masquerade ball, Waverley's sudden interest. "You," Frederick breathed, pointing a trembling finger at Cecily. "You did this. You planned this with him." "I merely watched you hang yourself, Frederick," Cecily said coldly. "I simply refused to cut the rope." Dominic stepped further into the room, closing the distance between himself and Frederick until he was towering over the smaller man. "Here are my terms, Harrington. You will sign a formal deed of separation. You will relinquish all legal rights to Lady Harrington's person, her dowry, and her inherited properties. You will never approach her, write to her, or speak her name in public again." "And if I refuse?" Frederick spat, a last desperate attempt at defiance. "She is my wife under the eyes of God." "If you refuse," Dominic said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper, "I will hand these forged deeds to the magistrates. You will be arrested for fraud before dinner. You will stand trial. You will be stripped of your title, and you will spend the rest of your life breaking rocks in Australia. Your choice." Frederick looked at the papers. He looked at Dominic's immovable face. Then he looked at Cecily. She offered him nothing. No pity, no anger, just a blank, absolute wall of indifference. "Fine," Frederick choked out. "Fine, I will sign." The exodus was swift. Within 2 hours, Frederick was packing his trunks. He was given a modest allowance from Dominic's solicitors, just enough to live quietly in a small cottage in Cornwall, far from the temptations and the society of London. Cecily stood in the grand entryway, watching the footman carry the heavy leather trunks out to the waiting carriage. The house felt lighter already. The oppressive, suffocating weight that had hung in the air for 5 years was lifting. A sharp clatter of heels sounded on the marble stairs. Lydia Stanton descended. She was not wearing her usual bright silks. She wore a sensible travelling dress of dark brown wool, and she carried her own velvet hat box. She paused at the bottom of the stairs, looking at Cecily. Lydia's face was pale, stripped of the smug, triumphant smirk she had worn at the anniversary dinner. When Frederick's money evaporated, so had her devotion. She was a survivor, navigating a brutal world the only way she knew how. Cecily understood that, even if she despised her. "He begged me to come with him," Lydia said, her voice tight. "To Cornwall." "And you declined," Cecily noted flatly. "I am a widow with no fortune, Lady Harrington. I cannot afford to live on a disgraced man's stipend." Lydia tightened her grip on her hat box. She looked around the grand entryway, at the sweeping staircase and the crystal chandelier. "You won. You kept the house." "I didn't win," Cecily corrected quietly. "I survived. There is a difference." Lydia studied her for a long moment. Some of the hostility bled out of the younger woman's posture, leaving behind a weary, cynical exhaustion. He never loved me, you know. He just loved that I made him feel powerful. Because you made him feel small. He was small, Cecily said. It had nothing to do with me. Lydia gave a sharp, humourless laugh. True enough. She adjusted her gloves. Good day, Lady Harrington. Goodbye, Lady Stanton. Cecily watched her walk out the front doors and disappear into the bustling London street. Another ghost exorcised. 10 minutes later, Frederick came down. He did not look at Cecily. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the floor. He looked like a beaten dog. He paused briefly at the door, perhaps waiting for a final word, a final reprimand. Cecily gave him nothing. Silence was the greatest punishment she could inflict upon a man who thrived on attention. Frederick stepped out. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind him. Cecily stood alone in the grand hallway. She listened to the sound of the carriage wheels crunching over the gravel, growing fainter and fainter until they were entirely swallowed by the noise of the city. She let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 5 years. He will not return. Dominic stepped out of the shadows of the drawing room. He had waited, giving her the space to handle the final severing of her marriage alone. He walked toward her, his footsteps echoing softly on the marble. "I know!" Cecily said. She looked up at him. The sheer physical presence of the man was overwhelming, yet it did not suffocate her. It anchored her. "I don't know how to thank you. You risked your own capital, your own reputation." "My reputation has always been black," Dominic said, a faint, genuine smile touching his lips. "And my capital is vast enough to absorb a few bruises. But I did not do this for gratitude, Cecily." He stopped a foot away from her. He did not reach for her. He kept his hands clasped firmly behind his back. The restraint in his posture was deliberate. He understood the fragile nature of her newfound freedom. She had just escaped one cage. He would not immediately trap her in another. "Then why did you do it?" she asked softly. Dominic looked down at her. His dark eyes traced the line of her jaw, the straight, unbroken architecture of her spine. He saw the resilience that had fascinated him from the moment he watched her endure that brutal dinner. "Because I have spent my life watching the people of this city destroy each other for sport," Dominic said, his voice a low rumble. "I watch them lie and cheat and tear down anything of actual value. But you stood in the middle of a burning room, and you did not let the fire take you. I wanted to see what you would do if someone finally put the fire out." Cecily felt a sudden, terrifying flutter in her chest. It wasn't the panic she used to feel with Frederick. It was hope, sharp, bright, and dangerous. "And what do you think I will do, Your Grace?" she challenged gently. Dominic's smile deepened. "I think you are going to rule whatever part of the world you choose to occupy, and I would very much like to be standing nearby when you do." He bowed, a slow, deeply respectful gesture. "I will leave you to your peace, Lady Harrington, but if you ever find yourself in need of a riding companion, I am often at the park at 3. He turned and walked toward the door. "Dominic," he paused, his hand on the brass handle. He looked back over his shoulder. Cecily stood in the center of the hall, the afternoon light catching the gold threads in her dress. 3 o'clock, she said clearly. "Do not be late." The Duke of Waverley laughed. It was a rich, full sound that chased the last of the shadows from the house. "I wouldn't dare." 6 months later, the air in Kent was crisp and tasted of impending winter. The sprawling stone manor of the Harrington estate sat atop a gentle rise, surrounded by ancient oaks. It was a quiet place, the kind of quiet that healed the mind. Cecily rode her dappled mare across the open fields, pushing the horse into a fast gallop. She wore a practical riding habit of deep green wool, her hair pinned up securely, but a few loose strands whipping in the wind. There was colour in her cheeks. The hollow, haunted look that had shadowed her eyes in London was entirely gone. She was free. The legal separation was ironclad. Frederick was in Cornwall, drinking himself into obscurity. Society had moved on to the next scandal. forgetting Lady Harrington the moment she stopped providing them with entertainment. She managed the estate herself now. She reviewed the ledgers. She spoke to the tenants. She existed on her own terms. She slowed her mare as she crested a hill, looking down at the winding dirt road that led to the main gates. A solitary rider was approaching. He rode a massive, coal-black stallion. Even from a distance, Cecily recognized the broad shoulders, the effortless, commanding posture in the saddle. Dominic. He had not overwhelmed her with his presence over the last 6 months. He had kept his distance, allowing her the time and space to reclaim her identity. But he wrote to her. Once a week. His letters were like the man himself. Blunt, intelligent, entirely devoid of flowery sentiment and sharply observant. He wrote of politics, of the absurdities of the ton, of the books he was reading. She wrote back. She found herself pouring her thoughts onto the paper, unrestricted. They argued over philosophy through the post. They debated agricultural reform. It was an intellectual intimacy that slowly, inevitably, began to bleed into something deeper. Cecily nudged her mare forward, riding down the hill to meet him. Dominic saw her approach and stopped his horse. He took his hat off, resting it on the pommel of his saddle. The wind ruffled his dark hair. He looked tired, but the moment his eyes locked onto hers, the weariness vanished, replaced by that intense, singular focus that always made her breath catch. "You are a difficult woman to find, Cecily," Dominic called out as she closed the distance. "Your butler told me you were inspecting the north fences. Your gamekeeper told me you were at the mill. I was beginning to think you were avoiding me." Cecily pulled her mare up alongside his stallion. She smiled. It was a real smile, reaching her eyes, bright and warm. "I do not avoid things anymore, Dominic. I simply prefer moving targets. Then I am glad I finally caught you." He looked at her. He didn't say how beautiful she looked, though his eyes communicated it clearly. He noted the strength in her hands on the reins, the clear, sharp intelligence in her gaze. He respected her far too much to reduce her to a mere ornament. "You rode all the way from London?" she asked. "I did. The city has become unbearable. Everyone is talking about the new opera, and no one is actually listening to the music." He shifted in his saddle. I found myself preferring the silence of Kent, or more accurately, the company. Cecily's heart performed a slow, heavy beat. The air between them felt charged, electric. This was not the desperate, frantic energy of their encounters in London. This was solid. This was real. "You are welcome to stay, Dominic. We have plenty of guest rooms, and I believe the cook is roasting a pheasant tonight." Dominic looked at her for a long time. The cynicism that usually armored him was entirely gone. He laid himself bare before her, offering no defenses. "I don't want a guest room, Cecily," he said quietly. His voice carried easily over the wind. "I am tired of being a guest in your life. I am tired of letters. I am tired of 300 miles of dirt road separating us." He reached out across the space between their horses. He didn't grab her. He simply offered his hand, palm up, waiting for her choice. Just as he had at the masquerade. Cecily looked at his hand. She remembered the cold terror she used to feel when Frederick touched her. She remembered the feeling of being trapped, suffocated, owned. But looking at Dominic, she felt none of that. She felt equal. She felt seen. She took off her leather riding glove, letting it drop to the grass. She reached out and placed her bare hand in his. His fingers curled around hers, warm, strong, and incredibly gentle. "The pheasant is enough for two," Cecily murmured, a soft, teasing lilt in her voice. "But you will have to help me review the quarter ledgers after dinner. I will not have idle men in my house." Dominic's mouth curved into a slow, devastating smile. He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a firm, lingering kiss to her knuckles. "I am entirely at your service, Lady Harrington." They turned their horses toward the manor, riding side by side. The sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the fields, burning away the last remnants of the cold. Cecily did not look back. She kept her eyes on the horizon, her hand steady on the reins, entirely the master of her own fate. Did you love how Cecily turned the tables and reclaimed her power? There is nothing better than a slow-burn romance built on mutual respect and absolute vengeance. If you want more deeply human, high-stakes historical dramas where the heroine actually outsmarts the villain, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Drop a comment below. What was your favorite moment of Cecily's revenge? And be sure to share this video with a friend who loves a brilliant, calculating heroine. See you in the next tale.